It all happened one Tuesday night, the kind of night where the weather couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or just stay damp and miserable. Inside the Anchor and Vine, a cozy but aging Italian spot in a quiet suburb of Toronto, things were slow. The sort of slow that made the old clock on the wall sound incredibly loud. Hey there and welcome back. I'm so happy you're here. Grab that blanket, maybe pour yourself a hot drink and get really comfortable because today we're settling in for a story you won't forget. Before we dive any deeper though, let me know how you're doing. Drop a quick comment and tell me what part of the world you're watching from today. And if you want to stay with us through all the twists and turns ahead, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a moment. Alright, let's get back to it. It was 9:30 p.m. and only one table was still occupied. Sitting there, looking completely alone under the dim chandelier light, was Mr. Antonio Tony Bellini. Now if you didn't know who Tony Bellini was, you'd think he was just a wealthy older man, maybe a retired real estate guy enjoying a late dinner. He wore a tailor-made suit that didn't crease when he shifted, and his cufflinks caught the light just right. His face was weathered not from sun and surf, but from years of having to look people straight in the eye and make decisions he probably regretted later. Tony Bellini wasn't just a wealthy older man, he was the sort of wealth that came with silence and fear, a very seasoned boss in the city's underground. He was focused entirely on the plate of ossobuco in front of him, eating with slow, deliberate movements. He wasn't using his phone, wasn't reading a newspaper, and wasn't talking to anyone. He was just present, completely still in that quiet restaurant. The man radiated a kind of dangerous calm, the kind that made the few remaining kitchen staff walk on tiptoes. The person watching him most closely was a woman named Maya. Maya was the waitress assigned to Tony's table. She wasn't famous, she wasn't a detective, and she wasn't anyone special in the grand scheme of things. She was just a woman pushing 30 trying to pay her bills by working double shifts. She lived in a small, slightly cramped apartment in Mississauga and spent her days either on her feet or studying for a nursing assistant course she hoped would change her life. She was utterly exhausted most of the time, yet there was a deep, quiet alertness to her eyes. Maya was small, with tight, practical braids and a perpetual stain on her apron that wouldn't wash out. But she wasn't ordinary. Growing up in a busy, multi-generational household in a rougher part of North London, she had developed a sharp, almost animal-like sense for trouble. She knew the difference between a loud disagreement and a real threat. She could tell when a joke was just a joke and when it was a thinly veiled promise. And right now her senses were screaming. She stood near the host's stand, polishing a wine glass that was already clean, and watched the interaction at Tony Bellini's table. The man who had brought Tony's drink and cleared his appetizer wasn't the usual waiter, Mario. Mario was homesick. This was Lucas, a relatively new busboy, maybe 18, who usually just handled water refills and sweeping. Lucas was hovering much too close to the boss's table, and he looked like a statue carved out of fear. His hands were shaking so badly the tray he was holding rattled slightly. He kept glancing nervously at the back exit, and his breathing was shallow, almost desperate. This level of fear was too much for clearing a dirty plate. Maya knew this kid wasn't just anxious about the big tip. Tony Bellini finished his meal and signaled for his usual drink. A single glass of expensive scotch, neat, no ice. Lucas rushed to the bar to get it, moving far too quickly for a relaxed environment. Maya followed him discreetly. The bar was tucked away and the lighting was lower there. Lucas placed the heavy crystal tumbler on the counter. Then, his back to the kitchen, he reached into the inner pocket of his slightly too large uniform jacket. His hand emerged holding a tiny, sterile-looking plastic vial, smaller than his pinky finger. It contained a substance that looked exactly like a few drops of water. Maya didn't need a medical degree to know what she was seeing. The almost surgical precision, the intense panic, the way he fumbled the small vial, but managed to quickly flick the clear liquid into the golden brown scotch before hiding the vial again. It wasn't some kind of drug delivery or prank. It was too cold, too careful, too terrified. It was poison. Lucas snatched the glass and hurried toward Tony's table, eyes fixed straight ahead. For Maya, everything slowed down in that instant. She had maybe 5 seconds tops. She could look away, pretend she saw nothing, and let the course of whatever dangerous plot was unfolding run its course. She was just a waitress. It wasn't her problem. Getting involved in anything surrounding a man like Tony Bellini was suicide, or at least a one-way ticket to a kind of trouble she couldn't afford. She had her nursing course, her rent, her whole quiet future to protect. But the image of the terrified busboy, clearly being coerced or threatened, flashed in her mind. And the image of the powerful yet utterly trusting older man waiting for his last drink. It was the total helplessness of the situation. 2 lives, one ending, one ruined, that grabbed her. He couldn't just stand there and watch. She did the only thing she could think of. She walked out from behind the bar, moving with a practiced, quick gait that came from years of navigating crowded rooms with heavy trays. Her body language was all about service, not intervention. Lucas was just reaching the table. The glass was hovering an inch from the mahogany surface. "Oh goodness, Lucas, I am so sorry," Maya said, her voice a low, friendly whisper that was perfectly audible. "Mr. Bellini, I was just checking the bar stock and I realized we are out of the good 12-year single malt." Lucas grabbed the 10-year by mistake. She didn't wait for him to respond. She reached out and with a quick, elegant motion honed from carrying 4 plates at once, she gently lifted the poisoned scotch from Lucas's tray. At the very same moment she used the edge of her own empty tray to discreetly bump the other side of his tray, enough to make the water carafe on it wobble. "Oh, careful, dear," she murmured, giving Lucas a look that was both apologetic for the wobble and intensely focused. "I'll take this back and get you the right one, Mr. Bellini. Sorry about the mix-up." Tony Bellini barely glanced up from wiping his mouth with a napkin. "The 10-year is fine, Maya," he grumbled, impatient but not truly angry. "Serve for you?" "Only the best," she said smoothly, smiling with the ease of a skilled server who knows how to control a situation. She placed the poisoned glass on her tray and walked straight back to the bar, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Lucas stood there, paralyzed for a beat, staring at her back. He looked less panicked now and more utterly confused and relieved all at once. He quickly set the water down and mumbled an apology to the boss, then disappeared back toward the kitchen, his mission incomplete, his life possibly saved by a silence which he didn't even understand. Maya reached the bar and, keeping her back to the dining room, she calmly poured the deadly scotch down the sink, letting the expensive liquid swirl away. She then retrieved a fresh glass and poured the actual 10-year-old scotch into it. She added a little flourish, a single drop of water the way Tony liked it sometimes, just to make the new glass look different enough. She took the fresh drink back to the table. "Here you are, Mr. Bellini. Sorry for the delay," she said, placing the new glass directly in front of him. Tony picked it up, sniffed it once and took a large sip. He didn't even look at her as he nodded a signal of approval. "Good. Thank you, Maya." "You're very welcome, sir." She walked away, feeling a sudden, intense flood of adrenaline mixed with absolute terror. She had just interrupted a major hit on a powerful figure, likely saving both his life and the life of a frightened kid, all in the space of 30 seconds, using nothing but her skills as a waitress. She hadn't just swapped a drink. She had silently switched the fate of an entire evening and maybe a lot more. She felt dizzy but strangely, profoundly alive. Hours later, after Tony Bellini paid his bill, leaving a generous but unsettlingly large tip, and walked out into the damp Canadian night, and after the restaurant was finally locked up, Maya was on the bus heading home. She was physically tired but mentally buzzing. She sat by the window, watching the familiar streetlights of her neighborhood glow. She hadn't said a word to anyone. The kid Lucas hadn't made eye contact again. The big event was over, but the small choice remained. She thought about the power she had briefly held in her hands. The power to let things happen or the power to quietly change them. It was a terrifying realization. She was just a waitress, living paycheck to paycheck, but for a single moment she had been the unexpected guardian of life and death in a nearly empty restaurant. As the bus pulled up to her stop, she stepped out into the cool air, breathing deeply. The fear was still there, a knot in her stomach, but under it a deep, surprising warmth began to spread. She had seen trouble and she hadn't run. She had used her eyes and her speed and her service training to choose life. She might have just stepped onto a very dangerous path, but walking toward her cramped apartment building, Maya felt a quiet sense of triumph. She didn't know what came next, but she knew she was capable. She knew she was strong. And she knew she would wake up tomorrow and go to her class, her future still bright because tonight she had done the right thing in the quietest, most human way possible. It wasn't about heroes. It was about choosing to act when everyone else was still, and tonight, a simple switch meant that justice, The simple, beautiful justice of one more day had won. You can spend years trying to outrun your past, building walls around yourself, believing that if you just stay small enough, quiet enough, no one will ever find the door. But sometimes the past just walks right up to you, sits down and introduces itself. Maya, or rather Aaliyah, didn't call the secure number Tony Bellini gave her immediately. She spent a harrowing night pacing her tiny apartment, the squashed mango serving as a strange, sticky reminder of the life she just ruined. She was cornered. If the syndicate that tried to poison Tony knew she intervened, she was a target. If the institutional power that buried her knew Tony was interested, she was a liability. She was trapped between a gun and a government secret. She realized Tony Bellini wasn't a danger. He was a lifeline. He was the only person with enough resources and enough sheer invisibility in the criminal world to possibly stand a chance against what she was running from. The next morning she didn't go to her nursing course. She took the day off work, called the number and agreed to meet. They met not in a restaurant or an office, but in a small out-of-the-way mechanic shop in a mostly industrial area near the port. It was loud, full of the smell of oil and burning metal and constantly busy, the perfect place for a private, urgent conversation. Tony was sitting on a stack of old tires, looking utterly incongruous in his expensive suit, talking quietly to the shop owner, who looked entirely unfazed by the visit. When Maya walked in, Tony simply gestured toward a quiet corner near an engine hoist. No bodyguards, no theatrics. Just him and the noise. "Thank you for trusting me, Aaliyah," Tony said, his voice carrying easily over the clatter. "I don't trust you, Mr. Bellini," she corrected him immediately, her tone flat and devoid of emotion. "I trust that your desire to survive is currently stronger than your desire to hurt me." Tony gave a dry chuckle. "Fair enough. That's why I brought this." He pulled a small, worn, leather-bound notebook from his inner coat pocket. It looked old and completely unremarkable. He opened it to a heavily underlined page and slid it across the oily floor toward her. Maya hesitated, then bent down and picked it up. The page wasn't written in English. It was a complex series of chemical equations and detailed instructions for synthesizing an extremely potent neurotoxin. It was dense, technical, and completely alien to most people. But Maya's hands started shaking as she read the lines. "This is called the Hydra Protocol," Tony explained, his voice losing all warmth and becoming purely informational. "It's a specific custom-made toxin, untraceable in the first 48 hours, designed to look like a massive stroke. It was developed 6 years ago by a specialized counterterrorism unit in the UK. This notebook was recovered after a failed black bag op in Manchester." He let the silence hang heavy. "The only people who know this exact formula and its field deployment method are about 7 scientists and 3 field operators," Tony continued, watching her face intensely. "And one of those operators was nicknamed the Chemist. She disappeared after the Manchester failure and was later declared deceased." Maya didn't deny it. She couldn't. The fear that had been her constant companion for years finally crested, but instead of breaking her, it forced a rigid, terrible calm. She looked up from the notebook, her eyes glistening. "You're not hiding from a rival gang, Aaliyah," Tony stated, leaning forward. "You're hiding from the people who designed the poison that was meant to kill me. They used their own old formula to set up the hit, which means they are eliminating loose ends." He paused, then delivered the final, crushing piece of information. "Lucas, the boy who tried to serve the drink? He was found this morning. Overdose. Cleaned up, packaged and discarded. They tie up loose ends fast. And you are the biggest loose end they have." Maya inhaled sharply, a silent, terrible gasp for the young busboy who was just trying to live. She closed the notebook, slowly sliding it back toward Tony. The game was over. The silence wasn't a choice anymore. It was impossible. "It was called Operation Clean Slate," she finally admitted, her voice low, scratchy and tasting like ash. She spoke not like the pleasant waitress but like a weary soldier. "I wasn't a terrorist," she clarified, looking him dead in the eye, wanting him to understand the difference. "I was recruited right out of university for my background in applied chemistry and logistics. It was a highly specialized, covert program run by a multi-agency group. The goal was simple, Mr. Bellini: to eliminate the top layers of organized crime in Canada, the UK, and the US without any public or political fallout. No arrests, no trials, just silent, systemic collapse from the inside." We were the poison, she finished, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. Tony listened, his face remaining neutral, absorbing the gravity of her confession. I was a field chemist, Maya continued, the words tumbling out now that the dam was broken. My job was synthesis and delivery, creating untraceable substances designed to incapacitate or kill, and training others to deploy them. I was told we were doing justice outside the broken legal system, eliminating the very worst. And the catastrophic failure? Tony asked, his voice gentle, encouraging the human story. Maya looked away towards the massive, greasy engine hanging from the hoist, reflecting on the terrible clarity of that past mistake. Manchester, she whispered. It was supposed to be a surgical strike against a human trafficker. Pling, in and out. But the intelligence was bad. The toxin, the one you just read about, was deployed in the wrong location. It hit a restaurant, a quiet, regular Italian place, just like the Anchor and Vine. She gripped her arms tightly. It wasn't just the target who died. It was 2 families, 3 innocent waiters and a couple celebrating their anniversary. Collateral damage, they called it. A failed mission. I saw the bodies, she continued, her voice catching. Not the sterile reports, but the faces of people who just wanted to eat dinner. They looked like the people I serve every day. That's when I realized the program wasn't about justice. It was about power and eliminating problems with terrifying anonymity. I refused to deploy again. I couldn't be the chemist anymore. She told him how she destroyed her files, used her program clearance to forge her own death certificate, and fled to Canada, picking the waitress job because it was anonymous, low-paying, and required zero history. She became Maya, the dead woman. Tony looked at her, the exhausted waitress who was in fact an exiled, highly skilled chemist, and realized she wasn't a pawn. She was a refugee from the world of invisible power. They'll never stop, Aaliyah, Tony said, his voice grave. They don't forgive desertion, and they definitely don't forgive a failed mission that walks around with the keys to their operation in her memory. You stopped my poisoning because you saw your own past, your own victims in that dining room. You changed the story and now they will end you. He offered her a look of true human empathy, not the calculation of a boss. I need to know who ordered my hit. You need protection from the people who will bury you again. This is the deal. You use your knowledge to help me identify and dismantle the structure that came after me, and I use everything I have to keep you, Maya, alive and free. She looked at him not as a mafia boss, but as a wounded man offering a dangerous partnership. She saw the shared trauma, the knowledge that they both lived in a world where rules were only suggestions. She took a shaky breath. If I do this, I have one condition, she said. No innocent people. No collateral damage. We fight them using their own silence, not bullets. Tony smiled, a true hopeful smile that transformed his weathered face. That is the best deal I've been offered in 30 years, Aaliyah. A deal for clean justice. He extended his hand not for a handshake of power, but for a simple agreement between 2 people who had just chosen life over chaos. She met his gaze, took his hand, and in that greasy, loud corner of a mechanic shop, the waitress and the boss formed the unlikeliest of alliances. The past was no longer haunting her. It was now a weapon for the future. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't the explosion you see coming, but the quiet, constant pressure that makes everything around you collapse from the inside. Aaliyah and Tony Bellini were now tethered to each other by a shared, dangerous secret. They spent the next 2 days working in a tiny, secure safe house, an old, renovated bunker beneath a quiet warehouse in the industrial outskirts of Hamilton, far from the polished streets of Toronto. Aaliyah didn't change her clothes. She just traded her stained apron for a borrowed, practical sweatshirt, spending her hours surrounded by whiteboards covered in chemical structures and organizational charts. Tony's people had provided the data. Lists of known enemies, recent business rivals, and all the threats he'd received in the past 6 months. Aaliyah, the chemist-turned-waitress, filtered it through her unique lens. The sterile, logical viewpoint of a scientist who once designed weapons for a faceless government agency. Look at this, Mr. Bellini, she said, tapping a dry erase marker against the whiteboard. She didn't use jargon. She used simple observation. The person who commissioned the hit on you, the source Lucas was terrified of, they used the Hydra protocol. That's my program's signature. But why me? Why use the only toxin that I, as Aaliyah, would instantly recognize? Tony frowned. To send a message, perhaps? To show you they are still in control. No, she countered, shaking her head firmly. If they wanted to message me, they would have used something personal, something tied to the Manchester failure. This is too clean, too broad. It's like using a diamond ring as a hammer. It's overkill unless the real target isn't you. She pulled up a digital map of the city's criminal territories that Tony's team had compiled. She highlighted all the key players. The bosses, the negotiators, the infrastructure managers. She noted that Tony, though powerful, was primarily a figure of stability and old order. If they wanted to dismantle crime, they would have hit the newcomers, the unstable figures, the ones causing trouble, she explained. Instead they targeted you, Mr. Bellini, the Rock. If the Rock falls, the entire bay is flooded. It was a chilling thought, grounded in simple logistics. The answer came violently the following afternoon. Tony had insisted on leaving the bunker for a few hours. He wasn't afraid of being hit. He was afraid of being separated from the daily rhythms of his world, something Aaliyah understood was vital to a leader. He was meeting with a mid-level fixer in a bustling Italian cafe in Little Italy, simply to maintain appearances. Aaliyah was with him, sitting at a back table pretending to read a newspaper, but really using her sharp focus to watch the street, the exits, and the other customers. It wasn't a poison this time. It was a sniper. A single clean shot blew out the small glass of Chianti directly in front of Tony. It was precise, incredibly loud, and the sound of shattering glass and terrified screams instantly ripped the cafe apart. Tony's instincts were decades old. He dropped instantly behind the heavy wooden table, pulling the fixer down with him. Aaliyah, moving faster than thought, grabbed Tony's arm and dragged him toward the kitchen, away from the glass frontage. She didn't panic. Her reaction was the cold, focused execution of training that had been buried for years. The scene descended into instant chaos, screaming patrons rushing the back door, overturned tables, and the smell of spilled coffee and sudden mortal fear. Tony and Aaliyah slipped out the back door into a narrow, greasy alleyway. Tony's driver and protection detail, who had been waiting in a nearby vehicle, reacted instantly, pulling the SUV around. Once they were speeding away, the adrenaline rush started to subside, replaced by a terrible realization. It wasn't a warning, Tony grated, clutching his chest where he'd been yanked hard by Aaliyah. That was a kill shot. They wanted me dead now. But look at the timing, Aaliyah insisted, her breathing rapid but controlled. They knew where you would be. They could have used the poison again. Slower, cleaner, less attention. They used a public, noisy spectacle. Back in the secure bunker, examining the immediate news reports and the street footage Tony's team had quickly obtained, they saw the broader, terrifying pattern. The attack on Tony wasn't the only one that day. While Tony was dodging a sniper in Toronto, news reports started trickling in. Too fast, too coincidental. Aaliyah pointed to the map, marking the targets. Look at what they are hitting. They aren't going after the hotheads or the violent younger crews. They are taking out the infrastructure. The men who provide predictability, financing, and stability to the underworld. Tony leaned back, his face grim. If you remove the men who enforce the order, what happens? Chaos, Aaliyah replied simply. A sudden, destructive power vacuum. But more importantly, the criminal world becomes vulnerable. She drew a clean circle around the targets. This isn't about dismantling crime. This is a hostile takeover. Your shadow organization, Mr. Bellini, doesn't want to eliminate the criminal hierarchies. It wants to replace the heads with its own. They are eliminating the old guard so they can parachute in their own puppets and control the entire global flow of illegal funds and goods, all from the inside. It wasn't a fight against an enemy trying to do good. It was a fight against a shadow organization trying to become the ultimate crime syndicate, using the sophisticated tools of state power, secrecy, untraceable poisons, and precise logistics to control the world's dark flow. The poisoning wasn't just about killing Tony. It was about ensuring he was the first domino to fall in a silent, coordinated global decapitation strike. Tony looked at the chaos they had uncovered, the violence, the complexity, the institutional fingerprints all over it. His world, which he thought was rough and dirty, was suddenly being polished and engineered by something far more terrifying. They're consolidating power, Tony breathed. They want the profit without the visibility. They want the underworld to be run like a quiet, global corporation. Aaliyah nodded. And they are using the one thing I helped design to do it. The Hydra Protocol is their tool for plausible deniability. I know the chemical composition. I know their timeline. And I know their ultimate weakness. Tony looked at her, the woman who went from dead file to lifesaver, who was now calmly analyzing a global conspiracy while still smelling faintly of restaurant cooking oil. And what is that? He asked. Aaliyah, looking directly at the map of targeted underworld leaders, let a faint, fierce determination settle on her face. The Hydra Protocol is a fantastic weapon because it leaves no trace. But every Hydra needs a head. They still have to get the final orders from a central, non-criminal location. A secure command post. If we can follow the communication lines they've established to coordinate these hits, we can find the person running the show. She had lost her innocence and her life to this program once. She wouldn't lose her second chance to it. Tony felt a profound shift. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting the delicate, unpredictable balance of the world from a calculated, cold takeover. He was a criminal, but he was a human one. The enemy was cold and institutional. Then we find the head, Aaliyah, Tony agreed, his voice a low promise. And we make sure this corporation of chaos never gets to run the city. He looked at the chaos map and felt a strange, renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't fighting for money, he was fighting for a messy human kind of freedom, and he had the most brilliant, most unwilling agent on his side. He knew the path ahead was dark, but together they were ready to take the next perilous step. Justice sometimes required the unlikeliest of allies. When you find yourself fighting a war against a silent, institutional enemy, the normal rules of loyalty and trust go right out the window. All you have left is what you know about the person standing next to you. The alliance between Tony Bellini, the seasoned boss, and Aaliyah, the chemist turned waitress, was built on the rock-solid foundation of mutual existential dread. It wasn't love or loyalty. It was a simple, brutal calculation. They were the only two people who understood the full scope of the threat, and they each held the precise information needed to destroy the other. Aaliyah knew the chemical secrets, the operational procedures, and the organizational mindset of the Shadow program, details that could land Tony in federal prison for life, or instantly expose him to every legitimate government agency on the continent. Tony in turn knew her old name, her fake death certificate, and her location. Details that, if released, would guarantee her recapture or elimination by the very forces she was running from. They were bound by mutually assured destruction. And in their terrifying new world, that was the strongest kind of trust there was. I need you to work with my people, Tony told her in the bunker, the air thick with tension. He was seated at a heavy, scratched wooden table, and Aaliyah was across from him, sipping weak coffee, her eyes already tired from days without proper sleep. I don't work with people, Aaliyah stated, her voice blunt and direct, the waitress politeness long gone. I work with data. People talk too much. People make mistakes. People panic. Tony nodded, accepting the criticism because he knew it was true. My inner circle is small, Aaliyah. Frank, who handles my money, and Eddie, who handles the streets. They are reliable, but they are old school. They see you as a danger. And they did. The pressure of the global hit list, the disappearance of the stable leaders, was causing severe fractures in Tony's organization, the kind of cracks that let the light in but also let the danger in. Frank, the financial mind, was deeply suspicious. He didn't trust anything that smelled of government or sudden, unexplained knowledge. He saw Aaliyah as a classic honeypot, bait dropped by a federal agency to compromise Tony, especially after the attempted poison hit. Boss, she just showed up, Frank argued heatedly one night on a secure line, his voice tight with anxiety. She saves you from poison, then suddenly she's a master planner talking about global coups? It's a setup. You're being played, boss. They want you distracted while they cut off your cash flow. Eddie, the street manager, had a different fear. He didn't think Aaliyah was bait. He thought Tony was compromised. The fact that Tony was sharing classified information about an enemy that had declared Aaliyah dead convinced Eddie that his boss was either losing his mind or had made a desperate, unsanctioned deal with some high-level player to save his own skin, sacrificing his organization's loyalty in the process. The boss isn't making sense, Eddie confided nervously to a trusted lieutenant in a small, crowded pub in New York City, their voices lost in the sports chatter. He's talking about shadow governments and chemists. We fight people we can see. If he trusts this ghost of a woman, he's not the boss we trust anymore. The loyalty was crumbling not because they thought Tony was weak, but because they thought he was unpredictable, a huge sin in their structured world. Aaliyah, keenly aware of the growing distrust, kept her distance, focusing entirely on the logistics of the threat. She knew that the only way to earn trust was to deliver a result that only she could provide. She needed to find the command post, the head of the Hydra, which she theorized was a communication hub coordinating the attacks on the underworld leaders. They are hitting multiple targets across 3 continents, she explained to Tony, pointing to her whiteboard. The Hydra protocol is a precision tool. This level of coordination requires near-perfect intelligence and communication. They're not using old phones or disposable SIM cards. They're using a dedicated institutional network. She focused on a single tiny anomaly in the data Tony's team had gathered during the sniper attack. The local phone records near the cafe showed an almost perfectly timed 20-second burst of encrypted data transmission originating from a building 3 blocks away, a known government services complex. This data burst is the acknowledgement, Aaliyah hypothesized, pacing with that focused, nervous energy she used to have waiting tables. The sniper confirmed the kill or the near kill immediately. That signal went somewhere. Not to a local server. It went straight up the chain of command out of the city and out of the country using a protected channel. Tony watched her work, completely enthralled. She was a different person when she was tracking a threat. She was brilliant, calculating, and absolutely unafraid of the vastness of the problem. Aaliyah, what are you looking for? Tony asked softly, watching her use his team's hacking software to trace the signal's path. A simple routing error, she replied, her eyes glued to the screen, her finger tracing the path of the data packets. These institutional guys are too confident. They build redundant systems, which means they use established, secure fiber optic lines. But secure lines are also traceable. They assume no one outside their sphere can touch it. She let out a small, satisfied sigh. There. A split second of lag time. The signal bounced off a satellite relay in the North Atlantic as expected. But it didn't jump to London or DC. It routed briefly through an old, disused military communications hub in rural Nova Scotia before jumping to its final destination. She looked at Tony, triumph and fatigue mixing in her expression. That hub is the anchor point. They use it as a secure jump point to hide the final command location. If we can get inside that hub, we don't just get the communication records. We find the final recipient of the assassination confirmation. We find the head. Tony felt a thrill mixed with fear. He realized her strength wasn't just her intelligence. It was the fact that she was looking at his world of crime with the unforgiving logic of the institution that created her. She wasn't guessing. She was reverse engineering a state-level operation. Later that night, Tony called a private meeting with Frank and Eddie. He didn't threaten them. He simply showed them Aaliyah's analysis on the Nova Scotia hub. He explained that a series of coordinated, seemingly natural deaths in their rivals' ranks were all linked to an institutional signature. He didn't ask for belief, he demanded efficiency. Whether you trust me or her is irrelevant, Tony said, his voice hard but low. The people who tried to kill me are not criminals. They are engineers of chaos. If they succeed, we all die, not in a street fight but quietly at home. She is the only reason we are still breathing. He looked at Frank and Eddie, their faces etched with doubt but also growing fear. You either give her what she needs to crack this hub or you prepare for your funerals. The choice is yours. Frank, seeing the undeniable logic of the coordinated attacks and the technical proof of the relay point, slowly conceded, his loyalty outweighing his suspicion. Eddie, seeing the fear in Frank's eyes, knew the situation was real. The fractures were patched not with loyalty, but with the cold, hard reality of survival. Aaliyah watched the exchange from the shadows of the bunker, her expression unchanged. She knew her life depended on these men. She hadn't earned their trust with warmth. She had earned it with the undeniable mutual recognition that they were all facing a common, terrifying, and very powerful enemy. As the sun began to rise, bathing the cold bunker in a pale, hopeful light, Aaliyah felt a familiar human warmth seep back in. She was fighting not for her dead past but for her uncertain future. And in that terrifying, complex moment, she knew that true trust often begins not with faith, but with the shared necessity of survival. Justice might be cold, but her fight was becoming fiercely, wonderfully human. Every terrifying story has a center, A place where the logic of the world stops and the simple heartbreaking truth of human pain begins. For Aaliyah, that center wasn't in a secure government building or a blood-stained alley. It was in the face of the man who raised her. After days of relentless analysis and planning the trip to Nova Scotia, the exhaustion finally caught up with Aaliyah. They were momentarily waiting for a secure transport window, and the silence in the bunker was deafening. Tony, realizing the sheer pressure he was putting on her, brought her a fresh, strong mug of coffee. He sat beside her, not asking for work but just sitting in the shared quiet. He wasn't her boss. He was just an older man who understood the weight of complicated decisions. "You speak about that program like you helped build it, Aaliyah," Tony said softly, finally breaking the silence. "You know the weakness, you know the science. That kind of knowledge isn't learned in a classroom." Aaliyah stared into her coffee, seeing not the dark liquid, but the dark rooms of her past. He had to talk about it. If Tony was going to risk his life for her, he needed to know the true, messy human reason why she became a ghost. "His name was Dr. Silas Vance," she began, the name a painful echo from a lifetime ago. "He wasn't just a handler. He was the chief architect of Operation Clean Slate, the man who saw the program as the final necessary solution to global crime. He was brilliant, quiet, terrifyingly organized. She was recruited right after her parents died. A young, brilliant, and incredibly lonely chemist with nowhere to go. I was 19, she continued, her voice growing stronger as the memory surfaced. He found me in a subsidized student lab in Manchester. He didn't offer me money or a job, he offered me purpose. He said I could use my mind to make the world actually safe, to cut out the rot that the politicians and the police couldn't touch. Silas became everything to her. He taught her chemistry, logistics, and field analysis. He was the one who taught her how to be invisible, how to observe the human story, how to use simplicity as a weapon. He didn't just train her to be the chemist. He taught her how to live, how to appreciate a good book, how to fix an engine, and how to recognize the subtle difference between fear and genuine honesty in someone's eyes. "He taught me things my own father never did," she admitted, her voice catching. "He told me he would always protect me. He was the only family I had left." She closed her eyes, reliving the turning point, the single night that ended Aaliyah and created Maya. The night of the Manchester incident, the restaurant where the toxin hit the innocent families. I was devastated. I went straight to him. I was crying, begging him to stop the mission, to expose the failure, to admit the moral price was too high. Silas, the surrogate father, had listened patiently, calmly, just as he always did. He held her, assured her she was safe, and told her he understood. "I went back to my quarters that night, believing he would protect me," she whispered. But she couldn't sleep. The guilt was too heavy. She got up, went back to the communications room to try and find the files on the victims, to maybe offer a silent prayer, a personal acknowledgement of their humanity. "That's when I found the order," she said, her eyes now wide open, remembering the cold, crushing betrayal. It wasn't a mission update. It was a communication from him, Silas, to the internal security team. He had authorized my elimination, my death, due to terminal moral compromise. Silas hadn't seen a heartbroken daughter. He had seen a liability. A sentimental field agent who might leak the truth about the program's collateral damage. "He didn't just want me gone, he wanted Aaliyah to die," she said, her voice flat with lingering shock. "The traffic accident story, the sealed records, he set it all up. He authorized my assassination to protect the program he built." She realized that the man she loved, the man who gave her a future, was the same man who had signed her death warrant. He was a scientist of justice, and she had become a variable he needed to eliminate. "I wasn't betrayed by a criminal, Mr. Bellini," Aaliyah concluded, looking at Tony, the actual Mafia boss. "I was betrayed by someone who believed he was good, a man who loved me but loved the purity of his mission more. He would sacrifice anything, even his own daughter, for the greater institutional cause." Tony listened without interrupting, his own face grave. He understood betrayal, but not this kind. This was cold, calculated, and devastatingly personal. It explained her terror, her perfectionism, and her complete, utter unwillingness to trust anyone. "And Silas is the one pulling the strings now?" Tony asked, cutting to the cold core of the problem. "He has to be," Aaliyah confirmed, her voice now steady with purpose. "He's the head of the Hydra. He designed the program, he authorized the use of the Hydra protocol on you, and he's coordinating the attacks on the infrastructure. He is using all the resources he built to consolidate power. He knows all the weaknesses, all the safe houses, all the procedures. He is the institutional threat. The realization settled between them. Their enemy was not a political rival or a foreign intelligence agency, but a deeply wounded, highly intelligent man driven by a twisted vision of justice. A man who had already ordered Aaliyah's death once. Tony stood up, walking toward the whiteboard covered in their plan for the Nova Scotia hub. Then we treat him as a father, Aaliyah, Tony stated, his voice ringing with a new, quiet authority. We don't go in with guns and chaos. We go in with the truth. We use your knowledge, the knowledge he taught you, to expose the failure that haunts him. We dismantle his structure so cleanly he can't rebuild it. He looked at her, offering a genuine human promise. You risked your second life to save mine. I will make sure the man who tried to kill you, the man who raised you, pays for it not with his life, but by having the life's work he chose over you taken away. That, Aaliyah, is justice. Aaliyah felt a single tear track down her cheek, the first she had shed since she told Tony her name. It wasn't sadness, it was relief. The man who raised her would finally be forced to face the consequence of his terrible decision. She nodded, wiping the tear away. She was done running. She was ready to use the knowledge her surrogate father had given her to destroy his cruel legacy. The time for waiting was over. The Nova Scotia hub was the next step toward a painful yet necessary reckoning. She finally had her purpose back. You learn quickly in life that loyalty isn't a feeling, it's a debt. And sometimes, the people closest to you are just waiting for the right moment to pay their debt to someone else, even if the price is everything you've built. The plan to hit the Nova Scotia Communications Hub, the critical link to Silas Vance, Aaliyah's former mentor, was precise and delicate. It required maximum speed and minimal visibility. Aaliyah had designed the technical approach. A ghost packet injection that would force the hub to temporarily reroute its high-security data through a known, less secure commercial fiber line, giving them a 5-minute window to capture the command signal's final destination. Tony trusted the plan entirely. The technical genius of Aaliyah, the dead chemist, was their best defense against Silas's institutional machine. But for the plan to work, he needed perfect execution from his team. And that's where the rot began to show. Tony noticed the first subtle sign of trouble the morning they were preparing to leave. He was reviewing the final logistics with Eddie, his street manager, the man who had been with him since he was just a kid running packages, the one who handled all the delicate physical realities of their world. Eddie was too calm. After the sniper attempt and the chaos, Tony expected nervousness, even panic. Instead, Eddie was detached, almost relieved by the urgency of the mission. He was meticulously packing specialized equipment. Laptops, fiber optic splitters, and electronic jamming devices. Eddie, you seem eager to get out of the city, Tony observed, his voice casual. Eddie barely glanced up. Just focused, boss. Want this mess gone. Tired of fighting ghosts. But that calm didn't match the history. Eddie was always anxious before a big move. More importantly, he packed 2 particular items that Tony knew were unnecessary. An outdated military-grade encrypted radio, and a new, pristine folder containing documents on a completely unrelated, defunct shell company Tony hadn't used in a decade. Tony didn't confront him. He relied on observation just as he had with Aaliyah. He had Frank, the financier, run a silent, deep dive into Eddie's recent movements and finances, not looking for theft but for motivation. The report hit Tony like a punch to the gut. The money wasn't missing, it was moved. Eddie hadn't been taking Tony's money. He had been secretly liquidating his own substantial assets. Assets Tony had helped him acquire over decades of loyalty. The money wasn't going to a rival or a vacation home. It was being routed through a series of untraceable micropayments into a specific, sealed trust fund that was structured to only become active upon the establishment of a new verifiable legal identity in rural Alberta. Frank, the cold, loyal number cruncher, called Tony directly. Boss, this isn't embezzlement. This is someone planning to vanish forever. A complete, clean break. But the chilling final piece of the puzzle came from Aaliyah's memory. Tony showed Aaliyah the shell company folder Eddie was carrying. This company hasn't been used in 10 years. Why would he need these documents now? Aaliyah took one look at the name on the file, a company called Clean Slate Logistics, and her face went pale. That's not a coincidence, Mr. Bellini, she said, her voice a low, painful rasp. That was one of the defunct shell corporations that my program Operation Clean Slate used to run ghost payrolls years ago. It's a signature. It links directly to Silas Vance's network. The sickening truth snapped into place. Eddie hadn't sold out for money. He was working with Silas. He's not being paid to compromise us, Tony realized, his voice trembling with a terrifying blend of anger and despair. He's being offered a ticket out. A total institutional erasure of his past. A new life, a new identity, zero criminal history. The very thing you had to fight to get, Aaliyah. Eddie, a man who had grown up in the rough, punishing world of organized crime, who was scarred by violence and haunted by his deeds, wanted the ultimate prize. A normal, legitimate, peaceful life. And Silas Vance, the enemy, had offered it to him in exchange for intelligence on Tony Bellini. It explained Eddie's calm. He wasn't focused on the mission. He was focused on his departure date. He was willing to sacrifice the man who had been his surrogate family, his mentor, his boss, for a clean slate. Blood wasn't always family, and sometimes, the deepest betrayal came from the desperate hope for a new beginning. Tony felt the betrayal deep in his bones, a pain far worse than any bullet. He couldn't trust anyone. He looked at Aaliyah, the woman he knew was legally dead, the one who hated his world and his methods, and realized she was the only person left he could trust, because their need for survival was perfectly aligned. The moment for confrontation was now, before they left for Nova Scotia. If Eddie was working with Silas, he was carrying the means to sabotage the mission right in his duffel bag. Tony brought Eddie into a small, windowless equipment room in the bunker. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just placed the encrypted radio and the clean slate logistics folder on the table. "Tell me about Alberta, Eddie," Tony asked, his voice low, heavy with decades of shared history. Eddie's composure finally fractured. His face went white. He knew he was caught. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just sagged, the weight of his guilt and his desperate hope crushing him. "Boss, I didn't want to hurt you," Eddie mumbled, his eyes unable to meet Tony's. "I just wanted out. I'm tired. I want to be a history teacher, Tony. I want to walk into a bank and not worry about a warrant." "And Silas offered you that," Tony finished for him. "He offered you the thing money can't buy. A life without shadows. He said you were resistant to change, that you were going to fall anyway. He said he was saving me," Eddie admitted, the tears finally welling up, a painful mixture of remorse and self-pity. "He was going to give me the papers after I confirmed the Nova Scotia location. After you were eliminated." Tony looked at the man who was like a son to him, a man so broken by his past that he was willing to trade one life for a phantom future. Tony didn't execute him. He couldn't. The cold calculation Aaliyah had taught him took over. Eddie was no longer a loyal soldier, he was a tool of the enemy, and a tool could be repurposed. "Silas Vance is the man who created Aaliyah," Tony said, gesturing to the corner where Aaliyah stood, quiet and observant, the ultimate counter-spy. "He's the one who buried her life and tried to take mine. He's not saving you, Eddie. He's using you as bait to find her and destroy us both." Tony picked up the outdated encrypted radio Eddie had packed. "This radio isn't for our mission. It's a beacon. You were supposed to activate it near the hub to signal our arrival and scramble our tools." He looked Eddie in the eye, not with hatred but with a terrible clarity. "Your clean slate is dead, Eddie. It died the moment you betrayed your family. But you have a choice now. You can either be a dead man, or you can help us take down the man who promised you a lie. You can use that beacon to lure Silas's response team into a trap," Tony proposed, his voice suddenly sharp with renewed purpose. "You can give me the chance to bring down the one man who ruins lives with good intentions." Eddie looked at the radio, then at Aaliyah, the ghost who walked. He realized his desperation had made him a puppet. With a shuddering breath, he finally nodded. "I'll do it, Tony," he whispered. "I'll help you stop him." The betrayal had been catastrophic, but it had yielded a new, unexpected opportunity. As they finalized their preparations, the raw wound of betrayal was quickly overshadowed by the fierce determination to survive. They were going to Nova Scotia not just to find a command post, but to confront a devastating, intimate betrayal that spanned from the quiet corners of a waitress's past to the cold heart of a trusted lieutenant. And in that moment of ultimate jeopardy, the bond between the dead woman and the betrayed boss became unbreakable. There's a strange kind of pressure when you're fighting the clock, especially when the clock has already started counting down without you knowing. Tony, Aaliyah, and a small trusted team, now excluding the contained and compromised Eddie, were hurtling east towards Nova Scotia. The air in the secure transport vehicle was heavy with silent urgency. The immediate threat of Eddie's betrayal was neutralized, but the underlying danger, Silas Vance and his institutional reach, remained. Aaliyah spent the entire journey focused on the technical aspects of the Hydra protocol, obsessively reviewing the details of the assassination attempt. She wasn't thinking about the past, she was thinking about the science. She had to understand how Silas's team was using the toxin she helped design and why. She started with the small inconsistencies. Why use a 10-year-old formula? Why deploy a substance designed for untouchable targets on Tony Bellini, a man they had just tried to shoot publicly? It didn't make logistical sense for a coordinated institutional takeover. Mr. Bellini, Aaliyah finally said, looking up from her diagrams, her face tight with cold dread. Tell me exactly what you felt after you drank that scotch. Tony paused, thinking back to the night of the switch. Nothing really. I felt the usual. Maybe a slight bitterness? I just figured it was the 10-year, not the 12-year blend I preferred. Nothing unusual. No sudden pain, no dizziness. And that is the problem, Aaliyah stated, her voice unnervingly calm. The Hydra protocol is fast. It causes immediate, massive neurological shutdown, mimicking a stroke. You should have felt something within 10 minutes, even if I was able to switch the main glass. She reached for the old leather-bound notebook Tony had kept, the one detailing the Hydra protocol. She flipped past the known formulas, past the established synthesis details, and stopped at a page marked with Silas Vance's own small looping handwriting, Project Chimera. Silas and I worked on a new variant years ago, Aaliyah explained, her eyes wide with mounting horror. We called it Chimera. We were trying to design a biological weapon that could completely collapse a syndicate, not just kill one leader. It was never finished. She pointed to the complex organic compounds scribbled on the page. The original Hydra protocol is fast and clean. Chimera is slow and silent. It's designed to be ingested without any immediate effect. The poison binds itself to the cellular structure and slowly, systematically degrades the organs over a long, untraceable period, weeks, maybe months, eventually causing catastrophic organ failure that looks exactly like a rapid, natural decline. Tony listened, his face slowly losing its color but remaining stubbornly still. He understood the chilling logic. Slow, silent death that cripples a syndicate by making its leader look weak, unstable, or simply old and fading. If the dose was small enough to induce subtle effects, or if the toxin was a new variant, Aaliyah continued, barely breathing, then when I switched that main glass of scotch, I might have saved you from the immediate fatal dose. But what about the appetizer? What about the wine you had earlier? What about the ice they might have subtly swapped out for a melting cube soaked in the substance? She realized her single brilliant act of swapping the scotch might not have been enough. Silas would have used multiple points of contamination, hedging his bet against a smart, observant waitress. The initial poison Lucas was holding, the immediate killing dose, was stopped, Aaliyah said, pressing her fingers against her temples. But there is a high probability, Mr. Bellini, that you ingested a background dose of Chimera, just enough to start the slow, silent process of organ degradation. She looked at him and her eyes, usually so sharp and analytical, were filled with a profound, terrible empathy. You may not have been saved, sir. You may just have been given a death sentence with a slightly longer expiration date. Tony sat in stunned silence. He had faced down bullets, blades, and bombs. But this invisible, crawling chemical death was something entirely new, something terrifyingly impersonal. Weeks, you said? Tony finally asked, his voice low and steady, revealing no fear, only intense calculation. Weeks, maybe less. It depends entirely on the dose and the specific organ targets, Aaliyah confirmed. We have to assume the process has begun. If we stop Silas, we find the antidote. And the only person who knows the final structure of Chimera, the final mechanism of the antidote, is Silas Vance himself. The mission to Nova Scotia was no longer about revenge or consolidation of power. It was a race for Tony's life, a desperate sprint against the slow, silent mechanics of his own body. The man who had survived a lifetime of visible threats was now being killed by the ghost of his allies past. Tony took a deep, steady breath, settling the terrible truth into his mind. Then the target hasn't changed, Aaliyah. It's only become more urgent. He looked at her with a fierce, unwavering confidence. You saved me once with a quick hand and a good cover story. Now you have to save me with your mind. And I will make sure we get you close enough to Silas to find that antidote. Aaliyah felt the weight of the responsibility. The life of the man who had risked everything to believe her rested on her ability to reverse the chemical weapon she had helped create. Her past had reached across the ocean and put a deadline on their future. As the transport sped toward the Maritimes, Aaliyah took the notebook back, her hands no longer shaking. She was a chemist, and a chemist's job was to fix formulas. She had to remember every detail Silas had ever taught her about Chimera, every flaw, every possible counteragent. She looked at the weary, determined face of Tony Bellini. He wasn't the enemy, he was the first person in years who hadn't treated her as a disposable asset. She had to succeed not just for justice against Silas, but because she couldn't bear the thought of losing the only true human alliance she had ever forged. She was fighting for his survival and in doing so fighting for the redemption of her own dark scientific past. They were going to the hub and they were going to find the cure. The closer they got to the Nova Scotia hub, the place that held the key to the antidote and the confrontation with Silas Vance, the quieter the small transport vehicle became. The silence wasn't fear, it was the heavy acknowledgement of the stakes. Tony was now fighting a silent internal war against the slow-acting poison, and Aaliyah was fighting the memory of a love that turned into a death sentence. They were bound by survival, but they were also bound by something softer, something far more dangerous. A simple human connection that had grown in the shadow of betrayal and death. Aaliyah, the chemist, had spent days analyzing the Chimera formula. She found hope in the data, the possibility of an immediate counteragent that could halt the poison's progression long enough to get the full antidote from Silas. But the closer she got to success, the harder she pulled away from Tony. He saw the change in him. The seasoned boss, usually radiating command and control, was softer now, more focused on small, meaningful gestures. He would insist she ate proper food, not just coffee. He would watch her work, not with suspicion but with a deep, quiet admiration. He had dropped the titles. He called her Aaliyah, and when he spoke her name it sounded like a promise. That warmth was a terrifying liability to Aaliyah. She remembered Silas Vance. The love and trust she gave him were the very things he used to justify her death warrant. Love in her world wasn't a shield, it was the ultimate exploitable weakness. She had allowed herself to feel like his daughter, and that sentimentality had almost cost her everything. She couldn't afford that risk again, especially not with Tony, a man whose life was literally ticking away. One evening, while parked at a remote rest stop on the long highway drive, Tony found her standing alone, staring into the dark woods, her shoulders rigid with tension. "We're close, Aaliyah," Tony said, walking up beside her. "You found the flaw in the Chimera formula. You're going to stop it." "I might halt it," she corrected, her voice cold and deliberate. "I won't stop it. Only Silas has the final antidote." She turned to face him, forcing a distance between them. "I need you to understand something, Mr. Bellini. My focus is on the mission. Nothing else. The moment this is over, the moment you are safe, I will vanish again. You will forget I exist." She spoke the words with brutal honesty, trying to drive the wedge deep. "I made the mistake of loving a protector once. I will not make the mistake of caring for another. Attachment makes me weak, and weakness gets people killed. It got Aaliyah killed the first time." Tony didn't argue. He just studied her face, seeing the raw, aching fear of repeating her past trauma. "You're right, Aaliyah," he said quietly. "Trust is dangerous. But fear is worse. It makes you run when you should fight." He then did something completely unexpected. He changed the subject, revealing his own secret preparation for an uncertain future. "Frank isn't just managing my cash flow," Tony confessed, looking back toward the shadows of the transport. "He's quietly dismantling the empire. Not selling it off but simplifying it. Transferring the clean assets, the real estate, the legitimate businesses, into a blind legal trust." He was preparing for the possibility of his own death, but also for something more. "I'm eliminating the points of failure," he explained. If I die, the system is designed to collapse into a manageable, legitimate entity, not a violent power vacuum. If I live, I walk away with just the clean parts, the things I built before I became the boss. Tony was preparing for a life where he might survive, but would no longer be Tony Bellini, the boss. He was creating his own version of a clean slate, knowing that if Aaliyah succeeded, his world of crime could no longer exist, not with Silas and his institutional network ready to take over. This organization, the fighting, the power, it was always a cage, Aaliyah. A necessary cage, but still a cage, Tony said, a shadow of regret crossing his face. If I live, I don't want to go back to it. I want a quiet life. The kind you're chasing. He was showing her that his motivation was no longer about power, but about the simple, fundamental human desire for a safe, peaceful ending. He was meeting her desire for anonymity with his own secret hope for retirement. His confession didn't soften Aaliyah's resolve, but it pierced her defenses. She realized that the betrayal she feared from him wasn't coming. Tony was preparing to sacrifice the one thing he genuinely valued, his control, to save his life and perhaps to match the price she was paying for his survival. I will help you find the antidote, Mr. Bellini, Aaliyah stated, her voice regaining its focused, professional edge. That is my only commitment. I will use the knowledge Silas gave me to destroy his legacy and save your life. She took out the small, sterile syringe containing the temporary counteragent she had synthesized, a precise mixture designed to halt the chimera's cellular binding for 72 hours. This is the best I can do. It's temporary, she told him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of fear. Tony rolled up the sleeve of his expensive shirt, revealing the scar tissue on his forearm from decades of street life. He looked at the needle and then at Aaliyah. Do it, he instructed, his trust absolute. And Aaliyah, I don't need you to love me. I just need you to survive. You're the only person who knows how to fight this war, and I won't let your fear turn you into a victim again. Aaliyah hesitated for only a second. She plunged the needle in, injecting the clear liquid, her hands steady. It was an act of science, of necessity, and of the most profound, unwilling intimacy. As the counteragent entered his bloodstream, Tony felt a slight shiver, but his gaze never left hers. They were now truly bonded. A man racing against the poison in his veins, and a woman racing against the fear in her heart. Their destination was the Nova Scotia hub, a final necessary stop before the ultimate reckoning with the man who had ordered both their deaths. The mission was moving forward, fueled by hope, defined by fear, and shadowed by a dangerous, unspoken affection that had become the greatest risk of all. You think you know your life. You think your choices, the big ones and the small ones, are your own. But what if the stage you live on isn't real and every person you interact with is just part of a massive, cold, scientific experiment? The Nova Scotia Communications Hub was situated deep in the woods, disguised as a defunct coastal weather station. The team, Tony, Aaliyah, Frank, whose loyalty was now absolute and terrified, and a few trusted technical experts, approached under the cover of a freezing, foggy night, the salt-laced air biting at their skin. The location was exactly as Aaliyah had predicted, highly secure, heavily shielded, and completely silent. It wasn't designed to send messages out. It was designed to funnel them in and redirect them, hiding the true command location. While the technical team set up the equipment to perform the ghost packet injection, Aaliyah and Tony moved inside. They didn't encounter guards. Instead, the facility was monitored by cameras and motion sensors, the kind of sterile high-tech security that screamed institutional. Aaliyah quickly accessed the main server room. Using her deep, intimate knowledge of Silas Vance's architecture, she disabled the security protocols and began the injection process. As the forced rerouting began, the hub's internal monitors started flashing, desperately trying to handle the flood of data packets. That's when Aaliyah saw it. Not the command signal they were looking for, but the data stored locally, the decades of records that the hub had been processing before forwarding. Mr. Bellini, look, Aaliyah gasped, pointing at a central processing log on a dusty screen. The logs weren't just about financial transactions or drug routes. They were detailed behavioral reports. For the last 5 years, this hub has been receiving reports on everything, Aaliyah explained, her voice rising with horror. Not just the organized crime leaders but local police commanders, city council members, major banking executives, community organizers, even the staff at the Anchor and Vine restaurant. She frantically searched for context. She found file after file. The Hydra protocol, the assassinations, the chaos. It wasn't just a hostile takeover, Aaliyah whispered, her face pale. It was a controlled variable. They were isolating specific subjects, the mob bosses, the police, the politicians, and running different threat scenarios to see how each group reacted when the central systems of power collapsed. Tony stared at the screen, the truth sickeningly clear. He wasn't the target of a murder plot. He was a lab rat in a colossal citywide maze. They weren't trying to control the underworld, Aaliyah, Tony said, his voice flat with dreadful realization. They were trying to understand power itself. How quickly legitimate authority fractures and how crime fills the vacuum. How easily a populace is controlled when they lose faith in both the cops and the criminals. Silas Vance, the man who believed he was doing justice, wasn't eliminating crime. He was studying the mechanics of control. The entire city, Toronto with its police, its politicians, its citizens, its criminals, had been his behavioral testing ground. The attack on Tony, the poisoning that was designed to induce a slow decline, wasn't just to kill him. It was to see how his network reacted to a leader who was visibly, to his own people, failing and fading. The public sniper attack was to gauge the civilians' reaction to street violence. The betrayal of Eddie was a study of desperation and moral compromise. We weren't fighting a syndicate, Mr. Bellini, Aaliyah said, closing the log files, a new, terrible resolve hardening her expression. We were fighting a science project. Silas is trying to build a perfectly predictive model for global systemic collapse. The criminal leaders, the law enforcement, the civilians, we were all just data points in his model. The shock hit Tony hard, but it also crystallized his purpose. He was a human being with pain and loyalty and the fierce desire for survival. He would not be reduced to a variable. He taught me the human story, Aaliyah, Tony said, turning away from the screens. He taught you the chemistry. He forgot the one thing he couldn't model: unpredictable human choice. Your switch, Eddie's betrayal, my decision to trust a dead woman. Those are variables he didn't account for. At that precise moment, the forced data injection succeeded. A final, crucial signal was forced through the less secure commercial line and captured by Tony's technical team outside. Got it. The command signal is live. Frank's voice crackled urgently over Tony's earpiece. The signal is routing to a single high-security building in Manhattan. A private research facility linked to a global security think tank. The location of the head of the Hydra was exposed. Not a bunker, not a hidden fortress, but a clean, modern building in the middle of one of the world's busiest cities. Aaliyah grabbed the hard drive containing the city-wide behavioral data logs. This data was their shield, their proof, and the ultimate weapon to dismantle Silas's cruel experiment. Manhattan, Aaliyah said, a fierce, cold resolve in her voice. The experiment ends there. We take down the command center and we expose the whole project. We show the world that chaos can't be modeled and that human choice will always win. Tony looked at her, his face a mask of weary determination. He knew his time was short, but the truth had given him an unexpected strength. He wasn't fighting for his life alone. He was fighting for the messy, unpredictable freedom of every person in the city who had been unknowingly reduced to a data point. Let's go, Aaliyah, Tony said, putting his hand on her shoulder, a final, necessary point of connection. It's time to show the scientist that his lab rats bite back. The fear of the poison was still there, but now, it was eclipsed by the blazing certainty that justice was not an equation, but a choice they were about to make. You can plan every outcome, model every variable, and anticipate every reaction. But the moment a human being chooses to defy the script, the whole perfect equation falls apart. The journey to Manhattan was a race against the clock, fueled by the temporary antidote in Tony's veins and the terrible certainty of the mission. They reached the high-security research facility, a structure of cold glass and steel that housed Silas Vance's global command post, under the cover of a massive early-morning downpour, the kind that scrubs the streets clean but leaves the people feeling damp and exposed. Tony, relying on the clean assets he had quietly accumulated, used a legitimate front company to gain access to the building's infrastructure, while Aaliyah, using her deep knowledge of Silas's security protocols, bypassed the digital shields. She carried the hard drive containing the city-wide behavioral data logs, the proof of Silas's experiment. They found Silas in the command center, A massive, sterile room filled with digital screens displaying real-time data flows from every major city. He wasn't hiding behind guards. He was simply watching his data, surrounded by the quiet hum of immense computing power. He looked exactly as Aaliyah remembered, impeccably dressed, calm, and utterly alone in his cold brilliance. "Aaliyah," Silas said without turning around, his voice carrying the calm, steady cadence of the surrogate father she once adored. "I knew you would come. The data predicted a 98% probability that, given the right emotional leverage, you would lead me directly to the evidence needed for your own recapture." Tony stepped forward, his expression grim. "The experiment is over, Silas. We know about the Chimera poison, the Hydra protocol, and the behavioral testing on the city." Silas finally turned, smiling kindly not at Tony but at Aaliyah. "The Chimera was a masterpiece, Antonio. A testament to human ingenuity. Slow, silent, and entirely untraceable. If Aaliyah hadn't performed that completely irrational drink switch, you would be dead already. But she did, and now you have, at best, a week left without the antidote." He looked at Aaliyah with a hint of professional pride. "Did you bring the data logs from the Nova Scotia hub? Good. I need those for the final iteration of the model." Aaliyah ignored Tony's warning hand and stepped into the center of the room, holding the hard drive like a weapon. "I didn't come here for recapture, Silas. I came to expose you. This isn't justice. It's a massive criminal violation of human rights." Silas chuckled softly, shaking his head. "My dear naive Aaliyah. You always saw the story, never the data. This is what you don't understand, the final piece of the equation." He gestured to a large screen displaying Aaliyah's own file, prominently marked with a single massive label, Variable Alpha. "You were never meant to be an operative, Aaliyah," Silas revealed, his voice dropping to the tone of a mentor delivering a final, difficult lesson. "You were the test. The ultimate unpredictable variable." He explained that when he first recruited her, he wasn't looking for a chemist. He was looking for a specific psychological profile. One defined by profound personal trauma, high intelligence, immense capacity for loyalty, and a strong inherent moral compass. "I built your entire career to test a single hypothesis," Silas said. "Would a brilliant trained operative, when forced to choose between the safety of a global mission and the random life of an innocent person, choose the mission? Or would they choose the unpredictable, sentimental human choice?" He walked toward her, his eyes filled with that terrible, calculating love. "I let you find out about the Manchester victims. I knew you would react emotionally. The only reason I authorized your death was to see if you would defy my final order, the order to vanish, and expose the program to save your own conscience." Aaliyah's world tilted. Her life wasn't a mission. It was a psychological treadmill designed to test her limits. "The drink switch," Silas continued, his voice full of clinical delight. "Lucas, the terrified boy, you chose to save him and the mob boss Antonio over your own safety and my own life. It was a completely irrational, sentimental, unpredictable decision." "You weren't a failure, my dear," Silas confessed, a hint of genuine affection in his tone. "You were the program's biggest success. You confirmed that even the most dedicated mind, when faced with pure human randomness, will choose the emotional variable. You proved that unpredictable morality is the greatest threat to systemic control." Aaliyah stared at the screen, tears of pure rage and comprehension burning her eyes. She wasn't betrayed by love, she was betrayed by science. "I am not a variable, Silas," she hissed, finally understanding the source of her pain. "I am a human being. And human beings fight for justice." Tony, who had been listening, moved quickly to the server bank. He had found the only thing that mattered, the antidote synthesis sequence displayed next to a timer set for the full fatal chimera period. "The antidote, Silas. Now," Tony demanded, his voice strained by the poison's slow work. Silas barely glanced at him. "The antidote is useless without the final sequence key, Antonio. And I only give that to my final model." Aaliyah looked at the hard drive in her hand. The data logs weren't just proof. They were the key to the final iteration of Silas's model, the one that required the variable alpha data to complete. "You want my choice, Silas? You want my data?" Aaliyah challenged, her voice clear and resonant. She turned and, with a swift, powerful motion, she slammed the hard drive against the edge of a console. The case shattered, exposing the memory chip. Then she brought the heel of her boot down, grinding the chip into fine dust. The screens in the command center flashed wildly. Silas's face, for the first time, lost its calm. The final piece of his life's work, the unpredictable choice of his favorite subject, was gone. "My data is gone, Silas," Aaliyah said, her heart hammering with a terrifying but exhilarating freedom. "The experiment is over." In that second of chaos, Tony lunged, grabbing a heavy metal rod and smashing the interface panel next to the antidote sequence. Alarms blared, and the system began to shut down, but the violence forced the system to dump the final necessary key onto the main screen. Silas let out a roar of absolute fury, seeing decades of work vanish because of the unpredictable actions of two people he considered mere variables. He lunged for a hidden side panel, but Aaliyah and Tony were faster. Tony grabbed the code, a complex string of letters and numbers, just as Aaliyah struck the main power switch, plunging the command center into emergency darkness. Silas was left alone in the fading light, his beautiful, ordered experiment collapsing around him. Hours later, after they had safely transmitted the complete behavioral data logs to investigative journalists and global security analysts, data that would expose Silas's institutional crimes, Tony and Aaliyah were back in their anonymous vehicle, speeding toward a secure medical facility. Tony, using his old instincts, quickly injected the antidote, a colorless liquid synthesized using the final key. As the poison was neutralized, a deep sense of relief washed over his face, replacing the shadows of fear. He looked at Aaliyah, the woman who had risked everything, including the purity of her own scientific revenge, to save him and the messy truth of human choice. "You're not a variable, Aaliyah," Tony said, taking her hand. "You're the reason we won." Aaliyah didn't pull away this time. She leaned her head against the window, watching the rain stop and the first rays of sunlight hit the street. She was exhausted, but she was free. She had chosen life, love, and the unpredictable truth over the sterile perfection of a man who loved an experiment more than his own daughter. Tony Bellini survived, and just as he promised, he vanished, ready for his quiet life. Aaliyah didn't vanish entirely. She took the clean assets he left her, funds she could never have earned as a waitress, and dedicated herself to using her chemistry skills to help people, not poison them. She was still Maya, but now she was a Maya who was finally, gloriously and unpredictably free. Justice, messy and hard-won, had finally triumphed, leaving behind only the possibility of a hopeful, complicated future. When you've spent your life building a wall of reputation and fear, tearing it down is the hardest thing you can ever do. It's an act of faith, a final surrender to the unpredictable human story you spent a lifetime avoiding. Tony Bellini was in recovery, the antidote having worked its silent, chemical miracle. He was safe, but his time as a hidden boss was running out. He had the hard drive, the comprehensive records of Silas Vance's citywide behavioral experiment, and the name of the Manhattan Research Facility. He had secured his life, but now he had to secure justice for the thousands of people who had been reduced to data points. They were hiding in a modest, nondescript house in a quiet neighborhood near Philadelphia, a safe house Frank had set up years ago for emergencies. Aaliyah was constantly monitoring the news, waiting for the massive data dump they had sent to the journalists to break. But the institutional power of Silas Vance was formidable. The story was being subtly suppressed, buried under political distraction and anonymous sources denying the claims. "They're too slow, Aaliyah," Tony said, standing by the window watching the mundane, peaceful rhythm of suburban life outside. "Silas's people are faster than the media. They're discrediting the journalists, freezing the leaks." Tony realized that the cold, institutional nature of the enemy demanded a loud, chaotic and human counterattack. The only way to punch through the suppression was to sacrifice the one thing Silas's model couldn't predict: Tony Bellini's reputation. Silas built his experiment on the certainty of control and the predictability of crime, Tony stated, his voice ringing with quiet finality. "He needs me to be the greedy, silent boss who disappears into the shadows to protect his own survival. We're going to give him the opposite." Tony's plan was simple, reckless, and absolute. He called Frank, his loyal financial manager, and gave him the final, irreversible instructions. "Frank, I want you to start the process of liquidation," Tony instructed. "Sell everything that ties my name to the syndicate, the legitimate businesses, the properties, the contacts. Liquidate every asset and transfer the total value, minus the clean trust fund, to the anonymous bank accounts we established for the city's major hospitals and community charities. Frank was horrified. Boss, if you do that, every single enemy you ever made and every single ally you ever kept will see you as a broken man. You'll be exposed, vulnerable, and penniless. Exactly, Tony said calmly. It's the ultimate chaotic variable. No protection, no money, no loyalty. I will become a target they can't ignore but with nothing left to take. Tony was sacrificing his protective barrier, the decades of fear and respect that kept him safe, to become a beacon of truth. By collapsing his own empire, he was creating a financial earthquake that no one, not even Silas, could suppress. When a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise vanishes overnight, the media pays attention. The second part of the plan involved public exposure. Tony contacted a single renowned investigative reporter, the kind who chased down impossible stories and didn't fear powerful enemies. He set up a meeting not in a dark room or a secure vault, but in the bustling lobby of a well-known legitimate hotel in downtown Philadelphia, completely exposed. Aaliyah was against it. Mr. Bellini, you'll be a visible target. Your enemies, the ones whose leaders Silas eliminated, they will think you orchestrated the chaos. They will see you as weak. Let them, Tony countered, meeting her anxious gaze with unwavering calm. Their revenge will draw the attention we need. We are using my vulnerability as a flashbulb. It's the only way to make the truth shine through. He looked at Aaliyah, the woman who had taught him that the best choices are the most unpredictable. You taught me that human choice can't be modeled. My choice is to stop being the mob boss and start being the man who tells the truth. It's the only thing that will ruin Silas's perfect experiment. The following day, the financial world erupted in chaos. Tony Bellini's syndicate vanished from the map. The liquidation was so rapid and thorough that it triggered alarms not just in the underworld, but in legitimate banking circles. The story exploded across news feeds. At the same time, Tony sat across from the stunned investigative reporter in the brightly lit hotel lobby. He didn't use technical jargon. He used the simple, powerful language of a man revealing a painful truth. He laid out the Nova Scotia logs, the Hydra Protocol chemical formulas, the fact that he was poisoned by an experimental government weapon, and the absolute proof that the entire city was being used as a behavioral test lab by a shadowy organization run by Silas Vance. Tony didn't demand belief. He offered himself as proof. I am a criminal, Tony stated, looking straight into the reporter's camera. I have done terrible things, but I am not an experiment. I have been poisoned by an institutional power that believes it has the right to treat human lives like data points. I survived because of the sacrifice of an innocent woman. I am collapsing my organization today not for money, but to expose the truth that your government has hidden from you. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. The combination of the financial earthquake and the public confession of the city's biggest criminal leader was a crisis too massive for Silas's team to suppress. The sheer, unpredictable audacity of the confession broke the narrative control. The story went viral not as a mob war, but as an institutional betrayal of the highest order. The media, no longer able to ignore the story, began running the Nova Scotia logs. The Manhattan Research Facility was immediately surrounded by federal agents and legitimate law enforcement, finally acting on the unassailable proof. Tony had achieved his goal. Silas Vance's perfect controlled experiment was over, drowned in the messy, chaotic reality of human choice and public outcry. Tony stood up from the table, his vulnerability now total. He was no longer under the protection of his reputation or his money. He had sacrificed everything for the truth. As he walked out of the hotel lobby, he met Aaliyah's gaze. She didn't look scared, she looked intensely proud. He had chosen the human story over the machine's model. You saved yourself, Mr. Bellini, Aaliyah said, her eyes shining with emotion. You chose the antidote for your soul. Tony smiled, a tired but genuine expression. He knew his enemies, now exposed to the world by his own actions, would be coming for him. His time of safety was brief, but his purpose was fulfilled. He had earned his clean slate, not through a government decree, but through a final, profound act of sacrifice. They drove away, disappearing into the city traffic, the news anchors on the radio confirming the arrest of Silas Vance and the seizure of the Manhattan facility. Tony, stripped of his power and his protection, was facing an uncertain, dangerous future. But he was alive, he was free, and he had redeemed his life. He had been willing to lose everything so that the truth could win. Sometimes the most important truth a person can tell is a lie so big, so absolute, that it changes the world around them. And for Tony Bellini, the final truth was his own disappearance. Tony knew that exposing Silas Vance and destroying the massive behavioral experiment had solved the institutional threat, but it had magnified the personal danger. Stripped of his money, his reputation, and his protective web, he was now the most vulnerable man in North America. A target for every rival, every scorned lieutenant, and every angry person who lost money in his organization's spectacular public collapse. He had bought the world truth, but he hadn't bought himself safety. The arrest of Silas Vance and the subsequent investigation into the Manhattan facility dominated the news cycle for days. The political and law enforcement chaos was exactly what Tony needed. A massive, noisy distraction. Tony and Aaliyah had moved again, settling into a dilapidated seaside cabin on the coast of Maine, a place so remote and forgotten that it didn't even register on most maps. The air was cold, the waves relentless, and the solitude was total. But Tony's physical decline started again. The temporary antidote Aaliyah gave him had held the chimera poison at bay for the precise 72 hours, and the permanent antidote had stopped the systematic destruction of his organs. But the damage done in the weeks before the antidote, coupled with the immense stress of the last few days, was taking its toll. He was tired, deeply and irrevocably tired. His eyes, once so sharp, were shadowed with exhaustion. He knew he couldn't maintain the fugitive life without drawing unwanted attention to Aaliyah, the one person he truly wanted to protect. Aaliyah, ever the chemist, tracked his recovery meticulously. "The antidote worked, Mr. Bellini," she said, reviewing his blood pressure and respiration one cold morning. "But your body needs months of quiet rest to fully recover. The slightest stress, the smallest fight, it could be fatal." Tony nodded, his mind already working on his final, necessary maneuver. He had given up his life of crime for the truth. Now he had to give up his identity for his own survival. He had learned from the best, the very organization that declared Aaliyah dead. The final plan was set in motion 3 days later. It started with a single untraceable phone call placed to a low-level former ally, providing an incredibly detailed, location-specific rumor. Tony Bellini was hiding out, weak and alone, near the docks of a small, forgotten fishing town in Massachusetts. The rumor was a perfect piece of bait, too specific to ignore and too vulnerable a location to pass up. That night, a small, heavily armed crew of former rivals descended on the designated dockside warehouse, ready to finish the man who had brought chaos to their world. The confrontation was quick, loud, and decisive. Witnesses reported hearing shouts, a few sharp bursts of gunfire, and the sound of a vehicle speeding away. The next morning, the city woke up to the headline: "Mob boss Tony Bellini found dead in targeted hit." The body, badly burned in an intentionally set fire within the warehouse, was identified through dental records and trace DNA analysis. The press reported it as a vicious, predictable end to a life of crime, the final, brutal payment for his dramatic betrayal. The police, dealing with the massive fallout of the Silas Vance investigation, closed the case quickly. It was a neat, satisfying conclusion for the public. Tony Bellini was officially dead. Aaliyah sat alone in the quiet Maine cabin, watching the news reports flicker across the tiny television screen. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes held a fierce, controlled certainty that belied the public tragedy. She knew the truth. The body was a clever combination of Tony's dental records, extracted years ago and stored in a discreet medical file, and the body of a man with similar characteristics, supplied by a highly discreet contact Frank had owed a lifetime of favors to. The fire had done the rest, erasing the necessary details. It was the same kind of identity erasure perfected by Silas Vance, only this time, it was used for an ethical purpose. A final act of human choice over institutional control. The subtle clue confirming the successful switch wasn't in the news reports. It was in the small, everyday details only Aaliyah would recognize. She walked to the worn wooden mantelpiece and picked up a plain, heavy coffee mug. It was the same style Tony always insisted on using in the safe house. A mug with a slight chip near the handle, almost imperceptible. Tony had always insisted that chipped crockery had character. Underneath the mug he had left a single folded napkin. Inside there was no note, no grand declaration. Just a single dried reddish-brown stain. The tiny specific color of the unique herbal tea blend Aaliyah had been brewing him every morning for recovery, the one he refused to drink from any other cup. It was a final silent message: I was here. I left this behind. He didn't leave a trail, he left a signature. He had planned his death not out of defeat, but out of a fierce, protective love for the quiet, normal future he wanted for Aaliyah. He had sacrificed his name so that his enemies would stop looking and so that Aaliyah could finally stop running. Aaliyah smiled, a single tear finally tracing a path down her cheek, a tear not of grief, but of profound understanding. Tony hadn't left her, he had truly set her free. He had used his last act of control to ensure the unpredictable happiness of the one person who mattered. She knew that somewhere in some quiet corner of the world, a man named Tony was beginning a new, anonymous life, stripped of his power but finally at peace. He had become the ghost and she was now the living truth. Aaliyah walked outside to the cold beach, the waves crashing relentlessly. She picked up a smooth, gray stone, turned it over in her hand, and then tossed it into the ocean, erasing her last physical trace of the cabin. She was now truly free. No longer a waitress, no longer a variable, and no longer the chemist. She had her skills, her intelligence, and the full, undeniable knowledge that justice had been won. She walked toward the small, beaten-up truck Tony had left for her, ready to begin her own clean slate, a future she would build day by day on the foundation of fierce human love and unpredictable choice. The story of the boss was over, but the story of the woman he saved had just begun. Life, even after the biggest storms, eventually finds its rhythm. The headlines fade, the fear recedes, and the unpredictable story that unfolded in the shadows finds its quiet, final chapter. Months passed. The chaotic, unpredictable truth about the institutional experiment had shaken the foundations of global security. Investigations were ongoing, reputations were ruined, and the clean, cold world Silas Vance tried to engineer was exposed for its moral rot. Aaliyah, now carrying a new, simple identity, a name chosen for its lack of history and easy anonymity, had moved south, settling in a small, lively coastal city in the American Southeast. She was working again, but not in a restaurant. She was using her knowledge for good, volunteering at a community clinic, assisting nurses and teaching basic chemistry to young students. She had chosen a life of quiet, essential service, a life built on healing, not harm. Her life was peaceful, but it was also solitary. She was free from the ghosts of her past, but she was still guarded, still listening for the sound of a strange footstep or the hint of a hidden observer. She was waiting for the final, unexpected variable in her story. That variable arrived on a warm, clear Saturday afternoon. Aaliyah was sitting at an outdoor cafe, tucked away on a cobbled street that smelled of sea air and fresh-baked bread. She was reading a textbook just as she always had, blending seamlessly into the background of tourists and locals. Then, a man sat down at the small table directly across from her. He was older, wearing a simple, well-worn linen shirt and practical trousers, nothing like the expensive, tailor-made suits she remembered. His hair was grayer, his face deeply lined, but the eyes were the same, intelligent, analytical, and holding a quiet, unwavering calm. He looked like a retired professor or a fisherman with good taste. He was completely unremarkable, which meant he was absolutely perfect. He didn't speak her new name and she didn't speak his. They didn't need words for the first long minute. They only needed the truth that hung between them, the shared history of betrayal, poison, sacrifice, and survival. "The coffee here is terrible," the man said finally, his voice deeper and slower than Tony Bellini's had been, but carrying the same dry, knowing edge. Aaliyah smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that touched her eyes and crinkled the corners of her mouth, a smile Tony Bellini had earned with his life. "I know," she replied simply, closing her textbook. "I bring my own blend." They talked for hours, not about the syndicate or Silas or betrayal, but about the quiet, ordinary things they had missed. Books, music, the challenges of dealing with difficult plumbing, and the simple joy of an afternoon spent without looking over one's shoulder. He was living under a new, completely unremarkable name, a name that signified a new beginning and a past that had truly been erased. He was doing exactly what he had promised, living a small, clean life built on the assets he saved. As the sun began to set, turning the sky a deep, warm gold, The new man excused himself, stating he needed a drink. He returned a few minutes later carrying 2 small glasses filled with a rich amber liquid. Scotch neat. He placed 1 glass carefully in front of her. Then he went to slide the second glass across the small table toward his own side. But Aaliyah stopped him. She gently took the glass intended for him, held it for a brief moment, and then slowly and deliberately she slid her own untouched glass across the table toward the man who had sacrificed everything for his freedom. He didn't look confused, he looked deeply, profoundly moved. He understood the gesture immediately. For a year, every drink they shared had been defined by fear and vigilance. The first drink was swapped to save his life. The next drinks were analyzed, sampled, and watched for poison. Their entire relationship was based on the fact that Aaliyah was constantly saving him, protecting him from a deadly internal threat. But in this moment, Aaliyah wasn't swapping the drink. She was offering her own. She wasn't saving his life, she was offering to share it. She had faced her greatest fear, the fear that attachment leads to betrayal, and she had conquered it. She was choosing to trust him completely and openly, to share the simple vulnerability of the last drink of the day, a vulnerability that was only possible because they were both truly finally safe. The body was a clever combination of Tony's dental records, extracted years ago and stored in a discreet medical file, and the body of a man with similar characteristics, supplied by a highly discreet contact Frank had owed a lifetime of favors to. The fire had done the rest, erasing the necessary details. It was the same kind of identity erasure perfected by Silas Vance, only this time, it was used for an ethical purpose. A final act of human choice over institutional control. The subtle clue confirming the successful switch wasn't in the news reports. It was in the small, everyday details only Aaliyah would recognize. She walked to the worn wooden mantelpiece and picked up a plain, heavy coffee mug. It was the same style Tony always insisted on using in the safe house. A mug with a slight chip near the handle, almost imperceptible. Tony had always insisted that chipped crockery had character. Underneath the mug he had left a single folded napkin. Inside there was no note, no grand declaration. Just a single dried reddish-brown stain, the tiny specific color of the unique herbal tea blend Aaliyah had been brewing him every morning for recovery, the one he refused to drink from any other cup. It was a final silent message: I was here. I left this behind. He didn't leave a trail, he left a signature. He had planned his death not out of defeat, but out of a fierce, protective love for the quiet, normal future he wanted for Aaliyah. He had sacrificed his name so that his enemies would stop looking and so that Aaliyah could finally stop running. Aaliyah smiled, a single tear finally tracing a path down her cheek, a tear not of grief, but of profound understanding. Tony hadn't left her, he had truly set her free. He had used his last act of control to ensure the unpredictable happiness of the one person who mattered. She knew that somewhere in some quiet corner of the world, a man named Tony was beginning a new, anonymous life, stripped of his power but finally at peace. He had become the ghost and she was now the living truth. Aaliyah walked outside to the cold beach, the waves crashing relentlessly. She picked up a smooth, gray stone, turned it over in her hand, and then tossed it into the ocean, erasing her last physical trace of the cabin. She was now truly free, no longer a waitress, no longer a variable, and no longer the chemist. She had her skills, her intelligence, and the full, undeniable knowledge that justice had been won. She walked toward the small, beaten-up truck Tony had left for her, ready to begin her own clean slate, a future she would build day by day on the foundation of fierce human love and unpredictable choice. The story of the boss was over, but the story of the woman he saved had just begun. Life, even after the biggest storms, eventually finds its rhythm. The headlines fade, the fear recedes, and the unpredictable story that unfolded in the shadows finds its quiet, final chapter. Months passed. The chaotic, unpredictable truth about the institutional experiment had shaken the foundations of global security. Investigations were ongoing, reputations were ruined, and the clean, cold world Silas Vance tried to engineer was exposed for its moral rot. Aaliyah, now carrying a new, simple identity, a name chosen for its lack of history and easy anonymity, had moved south, settling in a small, lively coastal city in the American Southeast. She was working again, but not in a restaurant. She was using her knowledge for good, volunteering at a community clinic, assisting nurses and teaching basic chemistry to young students. She had chosen a life of quiet, essential service, a life built on healing, not harm. Her life was peaceful, but it was also solitary. She was free from the ghosts of her past, but she was still guarded, still listening for the sound of a strange footstep or the hint of a hidden observer. She was waiting for the final, unexpected variable in her story. That variable arrived on a warm, clear Saturday afternoon. Aaliyah was sitting at an outdoor cafe, tucked away on a cobbled street that smelled of sea air and fresh-baked bread. She was reading a textbook just as she always had, blending seamlessly into the background of tourists and locals. Then, a man sat down at the small table directly across from her. He was older, wearing a simple, well-worn linen shirt and practical trousers, nothing like the expensive, tailor-made suits she remembered. His hair was grayer, his face deeply lined, but the eyes were the same, intelligent, analytical, and holding a quiet, unwavering calm. He looked like a retired professor or a fisherman with good taste. He was completely unremarkable, which meant he was absolutely perfect. He didn't speak her new name and she didn't speak his. They didn't need words for the first long minute. They only needed the truth that hung between them, the shared history of betrayal, poison, sacrifice, and survival. "The coffee here is terrible," the man said finally, his voice deeper and slower than Tony Bellini's had been, but carrying the same dry, knowing edge. Aaliyah smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that touched her eyes and crinkled the corners of her mouth, a smile Tony Bellini had earned with his life. "I know," she replied simply, closing her textbook. "I bring my own blend." They talked for hours, not about the syndicate or Silas or betrayal, but about the quiet, ordinary things they had missed. Books, music, the challenges of dealing with difficult plumbing, and the simple joy of an afternoon spent without looking over one's shoulder. He was living under a new, completely unremarkable name, a name that signified a new beginning and a past that had truly been erased. He was doing exactly what he had promised, living a small, clean life built on the assets he saved. As the sun began to set, turning the sky a deep, warm gold, the new man excused himself, stating he needed a drink. He returned a few minutes later, carrying 2 small glasses filled with a rich amber liquid, Scotch neat. He placed one glass carefully in front of her. Then he went to slide the second glass across the small table toward his own side. But Aaliyah stopped him. She gently took the glass intended for him, held it for a brief moment, and then slowly and deliberately she slid her own untouched glass across the table toward the man who had sacrificed everything for his freedom. He didn't look confused, he looked deeply, profoundly moved. He understood the gesture immediately. For a year, every drink they shared had been defined by fear and vigilance. The first drink was swapped to save his life. The next drinks were analyzed, sampled, and watched for poison. Their entire relationship was based on the fact that Aaliyah was constantly saving him, protecting him from a deadly internal threat. But in this moment, Aaliyah wasn't swapping the drink. She was offering her own. She wasn't saving his life, she was offering to share it. She had faced her greatest fear, the fear that attachment leads to betrayal, and she had conquered it. She was choosing to trust him completely and openly, to share the simple vulnerability of the last drink of the day, a vulnerability that was only possible because they were both truly, finally safe.